call to order the regularly scheduled Community Development Committee meeting of the Metropolitan Council. I'm Councilmember Robert Lilligren chairing this committee, joined by Councilmembers Johnson, Chambliss, Wolf, Cummings, Moose, I'm trying to do these by memory, Lindstrom, Ingebrigtsen, Vento, and Lee. And we are a quorum of the committee and can do the council's business. First, council members, I would ask for a motion to approve the agenda.
Move approval.
Second.
Any discussions, additions, changes? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. We'll move on to approval of the minutes of the March 18th, 2019 regular meeting of the CDC. Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Second. Any additions, corrections, comments? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. And so we are on to our first informational item. It's the Livable Communities overview. I'd invite Mr. Burns up for the presentation. Mr. Burns, thanks for being here.
For the record, I'm Paul Burns. I manage the Livable Communities programs here. And if I could get Greg in the back to bring up the council's webpage, we have a video that does an overview of the Livable Communities programs that is really nicely done.
Did you ask, Greg?
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. That's the PowerPoint. Oh, there we go, Greg. Greg, are you bringing up the webpage or do I need? Looks like the cursor's moving here. Please bear with us for this.
Yeah. So Paul, what you're looking for is just the regular public-facing council webpage.
Right, we have a if you go to the main council webpage, here we go, and then you go to communities. Oops, we had it there for a second. We have a video that was done by council staff that gives an overview of the Livable Communities programs, and we also have some videos of individual projects that if you have, in your spare time, and I'm sure you all have all kinds of spare time trying to learn about all your responsibilities here, but we have individual videos of individual projects as well as some static profiles of individual projects that we use as we direct prospective applicants to these sites to get an idea of what some projects have done to be successful, just to get an idea of what they might be able to do for their we're almost there.
All right.
So over on the right, Greg, see, all right, scroll back up, Greg. Video profiles of LCA projects.
Next one down.
Next one, there you go.
Goodness.
If you let me, Greg, I think I can find it here.
There's a little link right there where it says see video.
Here we go. Now we've got it.
One, two, three. Hey.
You might see one or two familiar faces here too.
Years ago, it didn't look like the downtown would make it. But now we have a thriving community with people coming to the area all day long for restaurants, for shopping, for living, for working, to enjoy nature. And if the Met Council and other partners weren't involved in that, it just wouldn't happen. It takes a vision in order to keep a thriving downtown area.
This would not have happened by the efforts of a neighborhood, by a vision of a few design visionaries. This really took the infrastructure,
we get a little higher
the big
volume,
scale,
please?
the district level thinking of the council to make this happen, what we're seeing today.
There will be a lot of jobs here. There will be people living here. There will be people staying here and working here, and really it'll activate the riverfront itself especially. There's going to be nothing else like it.
For our community to have a place for their parents and their grandparents to go, to be safe and comfortable, and to feel part of a community of people at their own peers is very important.
We believe in the power of place, the power of culture, the power of partnership, and a commitment to doing more than just building things, to actually engaging community in the work.
Now, if Greg could bring back up the PowerPoint, we'll go through my presentation. But I just thought you might be interested in seeing that because I thought the council staff did a really nice job
That's great.
at highlighting some of the projects, and I know a few of you have had projects in your communities. So with that, I'll start off by saying that the Livable Communities programs is a voluntary program. Communities choose to belong to the program and participate and agree to work towards producing affordable housing in their communities. And for doing that, then they're eligible to apply for grants. And this year we've got 21 million slated to be available for grant awards. There are 3 actual accounts within the Livable Communities Fund. One is the tax-based revitalization account, which is referred to as our brownfields cleanup program, where, as the name implies, the idea is to clean up contaminated sites, get them back on the tax rolls, and generating a positive property tax flow, as well as meeting a number of other goals in terms of jobs, affordable housing, and just neighborhood revitalization. The local housing incentives account is our affordable housing account, and that's done in conjunction with and through what's called the Super Request for Proposals projects through Minnesota Housing, the state housing finance agency. And then the Livable Communities Demonstration account is our third account, and that's the one that's a little bit more complicated in terms of explaining what it is and what's eligible. And within that account, we have a subcategory that's targeted to transit-oriented development. This is a map of the 96 participating communities. And as I mentioned before, communities agreed to setting affordable and life cycle housing goals and spending energies and funding to work towards producing affordable housing. And in return for that, they can apply for grants. We just added last year, Shakopee had been a participating community in the early years, chose to opt out when the first 10 years of housing goals was reached in 2010, but now has decided to rejoin the program. And most of the communities that aren't shown up here are communities that aren't sewered, don't have a lot of development potential, so they're not really great candidates for belonging to the program. Here's just sort of the statutory guidelines for all of the programs. Living wage jobs, a full range of housing opportunities, opportunities for affordable housing, and compact and efficient development that efficiently uses the infrastructure of the communities. As I mentioned, the local housing incentives account is done in conjunction with Minnesota Housing. And again, the idea here is to help with both rental and home ownership housing opportunities and to preserve affordable housing programs or affordable housing units. Again, the tax-based revitalization account, and here's one of the pictures we like to use showing the huge contrast in before and after on this site. Clean up polluted sites, highest return of public investment. So this is again, I'll get into the funding in a little bit, but this account is funded through a shift in the fiscal disparities pool. So as you might think about it, this is an investment so that once these properties get cleaned up, they generate more property taxes and eventually in the big picture will repay that investment through the property tax system. We also have created a few years ago after Thrive and council's efforts at looking at the affordable housing needs, identified areas, and in the coming weeks you'll have a more detailed presentation on what areas of concentrated poverty are. And to help with that situation, the council created a category within the tax-based revitalization account that targets these areas of concentrated poverty. And whereas in the regular program, you're required to have a redevelopment project that goes along with the cleanup. In these areas of concentrated poverty, the idea is we're going to help clean up these sites without necessarily having a project, but get them up to a level playing field so that they can be marketed for a new development. Most of the grants that we've issued for these areas are more investigation to determine the nature and extent of the contamination so that they're set up to be able to be cleaned up when a project does come along.
Oh, a question. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. Could you just, it's kind of hard in that map to tell where some of those communities are, some of the portions of cities that they're a part of, but would you mind sharing a little bit about what those?
Well, again, in a few weeks, you'll be getting a presentation on these areas of concentrated poverty. We realize this is very difficult to discern here,
Okay.
but they're kind of scattered, and some of them might be surprising to you where they're located, and they tend to shift a little bit from time to time in terms of when we get new data. But again, the best I can say is if you have a little bit of patience, our research staff, we just internally saw a presentation this afternoon from research staff that gets into a lot of the details, and I couldn't begin to do justice to all the depth and breadth of what those issues are and what the data sources are. Again, here's the demonstration account, which is a little bit more complicated to describe. And one example is in the local housing incentives account, the affordable housing program. The whole purpose is to fill that what we call the affordability gap to get these projects funded, completely funded. In the demonstration account, we specifically say we're not there to just fill the funding gap, but we're rather here to fund those kinds of things that take a normal project, raise the bar, create a better neighborhood, a better place to live, one that has that full range of housing opportunities and has more, creates a more livable, walkable neighborhood that has a mix of uses, a mix of income levels, and tries to create that cohesive neighborhood. Now, having said that, I'd say many years, at least 80% of the funding does include affordable housing, but in some years 100%. But it's to take a normal project and create a better living environment and blatant pandering to Councilmember Cummings. This is an example of the Hopkins artery, and I would encourage you to, if you haven't seen this, take a look at it. And here's here's the map of the areas that are eligible for the transit-oriented development category of development grant fundings. And as you might imagine, the idea here is to create projects that are truly intentionally designed to be oriented to transit and take advantage of that transit asset, as well as contribute to the ridership of those transit. And those little circles are the eligible areas. Those are half-mile radii around the station area, which is generally accepted to be the normal distance where people would walk 10 minutes to get to a transit station.
Mr. Chair.
Sure. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question too. So I see a couple of circles in Maple Grove. I'm assuming they've got a major park and ride or something with their bus service up there.
Like, yeah, again, we'll get into this later in the year when we bring these awards to you. But yes, the definitions of what's an eligible TOD eligible area includes high frequency bus routes and high frequency express bus route stations. So those circles out in the outer reaches are those high frequency express bus stations.
And Mr. Chair, just one quick. So just because there's a park and ride or a bus transit station, if they don't meet certain criteria, though, they may still not be eligible.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, that's correct. There's a frequency, I think it's every half hour for those high frequency bus stations. So just a park and ride doesn't fit that that definition. The idea is something that's tangible enough where a developer might actually design a project to be oriented to that transit station, whereas a park and ride on it by and large of itself isn't something that would be something that would factor into a developer's choice to at least design that project to be oriented to that station.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Burns.
Mr. Chair, I'd also add that under what we call the regular Livable Communities Demonstration Account, transit access does factor into the scoring. And to anticipate a question from Councilmember Wolf, the lack of transit does not necessarily penalize an application either. When the review process happens, the review is scaled to that type of community. And now here is the funding levels for this year. The tax-based revitalization account, as I mentioned, is a statutory shift in the fiscal disparities pool of $5 million per year. As you see there, we've got balances that we were able to offer an additional 1.9 million or 0.9 million to that, what we're offering this year. Likewise, the Seeding Equitable Environmental Development Program has, since we created it, been able to be funded because we've had balances, and we've been spending down those balances. So this year, in the past, we've offered $1 million. This year, the council's offering $500,000. The Livable Communities Demonstration Account, we call the regular program, $7.5 million has been the historical level. In 2011, when the council created the transit-oriented development category, the council had not been levying to the full amount allowed by law. The demonstration account has its own levy, and so the council at that time started levying to the maximum, And so we've been able to use that additional levy to fund the transit-oriented development category. And the levy doesn't completely cover that, but again, we've been able to use balances to offer $5 million to the TOD category on a consistent basis. The local housing incentives account by statute is funded by a $1 million per year shift from the council's general fund and $500,000 from the demonstration account levy. And at the end of this, we'll have a quiz to see if you remember.
Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just briefly, too, again, there's that 21.4 million slated for funding in 2019. Do you know what the total funding request level was?
Mr. Burns.
I'm sorry, what the request level for what was?
For the same round of funding, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, I don't remember exactly because, we have two, and I'll get into this in a minute, but we have two cycles of the TBRA and the pre-development grants. And again, I'm probably confusing you here, but and one round of the demonstration account, the local housing incentives account, and the TOD categories. We typically we're oversubscribed typically from year to year. That amount varies. Last year, we did not award all of the transit-oriented development account funding, but language that's been written into the council's annual fund distribution plan for livable communities allows us within the demonstration account to shift those offerings within that account. We can't say shift from that account into TBRA or the local housing incentives account. But typically we are oversubscribed. It's just by how much. And when we are undersubscribed in, say, the TOD category, we're able to use that allocation back into the regular program. And that's really worked out quite well.
Thank
you. So here's the calendar. As I mentioned, the TBRA account, we have two sessions, one in the spring and May 1st, I believe the typical deadline is, and then November 1st. And under the demonstration account, we have pre-development grants to help projects get ready to come in for the full development grant. We've been offering 2 rounds of those, both for the regular and the TOD categories, and that really has helped projects get teed up to be ready to be more successful when they do come in. Local housing incentives account, as I mentioned, is done in conjunction with Minnesota Housing, and that's 1 round. And then the demonstration account, both the regular and the TOD, has 1 round. And that's a pretty extensive review process. So since the first grants were awarded in 1996, we've awarded over $400 million through 1,086 grants to 83 communities, and you can read through some of the other award amounts there. Typically, we're a relatively small portion of the total project cost, but I don't think you'll hear anybody that's received a grant that says, no, we don't need that money. So here's a series of maps that kind of shows you where they've been awarded geographically. This is the local housing incentives accounts, and in that category, we try to give preference to requests from the suburbs. And I know you haven't probably heard about the housing performance score process yet, but the idea here is that we use the scores in an inverse so that communities with a low housing performance score are given preference under the local housing incentives account. So we're trying to help them improve their housing performance scores, get more affordable housing in suburban locations that also need affordable housing.
I'm sorry, question. Councilmember Bento.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Burns, does I'm back a couple slides, I apologize, but does the 2,400 acres of contaminated land cleanup, does that include Arden Hills at all?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Burns.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Burns.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, the Arden Hills site, I think they call it Rice Street Commons, is a Superfund, a federal Superfund site.
That's right. Okay.
And the federal government, Department of Defense, has been cleaning those up. So we don't fund Superfund sites. We don't fund contaminated sites where there's a responsible party that's been identified. So that we don't. If there's a responsible party that's got resources, we expect those parties to do the cleanup on those sites. And the using the number of acres is somewhat misleading because an acre of contamination that's only an inch deep is one thing, but if you've got 200 square feet that's 15 feet deep, that can have just as big an impact. But again, I kind of glossed over these outcomes. So those are some pretty 47,000 housing units, 24,000 affordable. We're pretty proud of the accomplishments that we've helped generate. And especially the leverage numbers are pretty significant. So again, here's the distribution of where the local housing incentives account funds have gone. This is the TBRA, and as you might expect, there's a more concentration in the more heavily industrialized areas. So the majority of I shouldn't say the majority, but a number of the funding has gone there. Should also point out that by statute, when there is more requested in funding than we have funding available, we cannot award more than 75% to the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and we cannot award more than 50% of the available funds to any one city. Those are statutory limitations. Here's the demonstration account awards, and I'd also like to point out that under council policy, longstanding council policy that has succeeded through several administrations, the advisory committee that makes recommendations on demonstration account funding cannot recommend more than 40% of the available funding go to the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul in any given year. So again, fairness and equity and distribution of geographic distribution. And so this is a conglomeration of all of the accounts and the geographic distribution. So here's some examples of projects. Again, building on the video, but here's another project in Hastings. Well, I think it was on the video. This is what the before site looked like, and here's the end project.
Mr. Chair,
Councilmember Wolf.
I would just point out that before picture, that lot was vacant for more than 30 years
Wow.
before that development happened.
Impressive. Thank you. Mr. Burns.
Here's an interesting project in North Minneapolis, Commons on Penn. This was the before site, and here's the after. This is a mixed-use project. It's got affordable housing above and office space, and what was a grocery co-op that unfortunately, from my understanding, has been not open for a number of months.
Chair.
Yep. Councilmember Atlasing, President.
Just to provide an update, there's now North Point has a food shelf that they're operating out of that space.
Thank you. Mr. Burns.
Here's another site in downtown Minneapolis that's been redeveloped into commercial space on the first floor as well as affordable housing above. And this project also in the northwest corner built in a little notch into the building to serve as a bus shelter. So we don't fund regular construction bus shelters, but when there's a bus shelter that's architecturally integrated and designed to be part of the project, our funds will fund that sort. Here's another site in St. Paul that there's no housing in this project, but it was a former semi-industrial site that was redeveloped into multiple uses. And then here's another outstanding project in Edina that was a former bank building that has now been redeveloped into a homeless youth facility. Another project in Robbinsdale, and this is the local housing incentives account funding. Actually, 66 West got also LCDA funding as well. Here's a couple of cleanup examples. Surly Brewing, this was a highly contaminated site that we helped clean up, and I'm sure you're probably all familiar with Surly Brewing. And this is another site in Hopkins that we helped clean up. And this is what it looks like now. And this is just a sampling. There's any number of other projects around the region that we've helped. Here's some feedback we've gotten from communities. And here's some developer feedback. Here's another one from a developer that hasn't always been successful, but acknowledges that you're not always going to be successful. Now, on the demonstration account, the local housing incentives account, as I mentioned, is done in conjunction with Minnesota Housing. Tax-based revitalization account is done in close coordination with Deed, Hennepin County, and Ramsey County in terms of cleanup, and make sure that we're helping fill all the pieces of the puzzle, funding puzzle for that. But for the advisory committee, or the demonstration account for both the regular and the TOD, we have a very extensive review process that includes voluntary design team meetings, project concept plans, which are a pre-application where we give them feedback on how to make their projects more competitive. And it goes through a step one process where it's a group of subject matter experts of council staff that review more quantitative kinds of parts of the application, but then it goes to an outside advisory committee that's comprised of these disciplines, and they review the projects for their catalytic value, their demonstration value, and their readiness. And we have just an excellent group of folks that have a huge amount of expertise that they're donating their time, and they make the final recommendation to your committee.
Mr. Burns, I have a question from Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. This morning I was invited to the Dakota County Legislative Breakfast, and a lot of the county officials and the legislators who attended expressed concerns about the growing issue of homelessness and housing insecurity in Dakota County. In particular, officials from Hastings were talking about how they want to do something about, like, build a homeless shelter, for example, but there's no transit going down there from the cities and back and forth. How exactly does a city like Hastings tap into this particular local housing incentives account grant?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Lee, Dakota County has a very active community development agency, and that agency, as well as the individual communities, have been very active in applying for not only local housing incentives accounts, but grants, but also demonstration account grants. We showed you in the video, there was both that low-income housing art space project in Hastings, and on the other end of downtown, there's a former factory that's being redeveloped into apartments, hotel, and some commercial space. But most of the affordable housing that we fund in Dakota County is generally through the Community Development Agency, but some also individual cities have come to us. Many of the sites in Dakota County don't have transit, but I think you'll hear, as you know, in the upcoming weeks, you'll hear that there's a lot of people that qualify for affordable housing that do own cars, and Dakota County has developed projects throughout the county for that population.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answers your question fully, but that's how we've helped contribute.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Burns.
And with that, I'm done.
Mr. Burns, I have a question, please. So, how do we ensure through either our scoring criteria or other ways that we're leveraging our funds with other public sector funding for projects?
Mr. Chair, there's a different angle for each of the accounts. As I said, local housing incentives account, we coordinate with Minnesota Housing and take advantage of their underwriters, reviewers to look at the pro formas there, and we work with them to try to figure out where we can have an impact with our relatively limited amount of affordable housing funding. With the tax-based revitalization account, we do a similar process with Deed and Hennepin County and Ramsey County. Again, we try to figure out, sometimes our money is used as a match for Deed funding. So again, it's an interactive process with the other funders. For the demonstration account, we have questions in our application form that ask, we're looking for all the other funding sources, and our housing, as I mentioned, is a step one review process. One of the subject matter experts is our affordable housing staff, and they take a look at where the other funding sources are at. And frankly, sometimes we're early money in, and some of those other funding sources aren't there yet. And sometimes that doesn't work out, but we don't disperse any money until there's an actual eligible cost incurred. So we're not really at risk, other than sometimes our money is tied up in projects that aren't successful. But I think we do a pretty good job at trying to take reasonable risks, and we have some great housing staff people that are pretty knowledgeable about individual communities' needs.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question.
Yep, thank you. Other questions? Councilmember Johnson, then Councilmember Allison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe you covered this, but do we track the increased tax base after the projects are completed? So you've got pre-development tax base, which is not good in some cases, of course, but do we track those numbers too, so that we can look at what the investments, public investment, private investment, total investment, and what that outcome is as far as impact?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, not as systematically as I would like. Some cities do that on their own. When we have gone back and done case studies to develop a sampling of communities and gone back and double checked the outcome, we just did that a year or so ago, and I was actually pretty gratified to see that it's tracking pretty closely, not only with tax base increase, but also, well, housing units is pretty easy to count because they're a physical thing. But jobs is one of the most difficult things to try and track. But again, when we went back and did case studies, it tracked a lot better than I thought it was. But to your basic question, we don't have a systematic tracking system to track every single project.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just one quick follow-up. So the tax-based revitalization account comes from fiscal disparities.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Burns.
Councilmember Johnson, that's correct.
And Mr. Chair, so it does say as one of your bullet points, enhance the municipality's tax base, which is obvious. And I think that's interesting because fiscal disparities, when you think about it, I think the original intent, or at least one of the original intents, was to help share tax base from cities that were growing, especially after the 1970-something act that created it, to reinvest into other parts of the region. And so, case in point, at least on that, it's very clear. You can probably go back in. So for me, that's just very interesting because you can literally track and show what that investment paid back to a community, which expanded the tax base, which I appreciate. So I don't know if maybe, in certain accounts it's more easy to track, which I'm sure it is, but I just appreciate that because that's something that I am interested in.
Mr. Burns.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, we also have started trying to track that and been asking about increasing that tax capacity for the demonstration account too, because it's a little less direct, but the same thing happens in those projects as well. And it does add to the tax base of the community.
Councilmember Johnson.
And just briefly, I think that's important for us to know as much as possible because a lot of times people will question, are these funds having the impact that we're trying to have? And so for us to be able to, certainly on a global scale, show what a macro impact would be for a year or given set of years, or even project by project basis would be helpful. I know as a local elected official, if I could show using TIF what the outcome would be once it rolled back onto the tax rolls fully, and that gap, that really helped, I think, quell the fears of people who didn't fully understand TIF as one example.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Burns?
Councilmember Johnson, that's why when I came here, I started asking to track the demonstration account increase in that tax capacity because from experience in defending public project programs to the legislature, that's a pretty straightforward number that, these programs are funded through property taxes, so it's not so much just a subsidy, but it's an investment that eventually, indirectly at least, gets amortized back into the system. And the demonstration account, as I said, has more qualitative outcomes and benefits, but in addition to those, there's pretty rarely that you don't see an increase in property tax rate.
Thank you. Further discussion on this presentation, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to make any assumptions about this, so I wanted to just ask, but what is how are we defining affordable housing? Is it 1% of AMI, or is it depend on the project and it's varied?
Mr. Burns.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, thank you for that question. The council has established a definition of affordable housing of up to 80% of AMI. So that's our definition of AMI as area median income, and that's our definition of affordable housing. Under the other housing programs funded, say, through Minnesota Housing, they generally stop at 60% of area median income, at least, let's say, low-income housing tax credits, that's at 60%, and we rely on Minnesota Housing to track those compliance with those affordability levels. If we get an application for a project that goes beyond between 60 and 80% AMI, we ask the community to show us what kind of mechanism they're going to put in place to guarantee that affordability level for a minimum of 15 years.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Sure. Just to follow up, Mr. Burns, could you share about what is the understanding for the AMI for those who are most commonly impacted by housing disparities or housing instability? I'm thinking of groups that are more disproportionately impacted by housing stability. What's the type of affordable housing for them? Do you know?
Mr. Chair, Council Member, usually up to 30% AMI is considered very low income, and we give points for projects that do include that. I think some of the low-income housing tax credit funding requires a certain amount of units for homeless people as well, and we frequently get projects that will be funding creating units for homeless people.
Chair.
Councilmember.
Oh. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Ms. Barajas.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, I just wanted to add to that at the end of our meeting today that Libby will be giving a broader discussion around housing, the council's role in housing, as well as addressing some of the questions that you've asked today too.
Well, maybe just so that you have it, that's my last little question as it relates to this. It would be nice to know when projects do come before us, what's the level of AMI that is a part of that project, and it's quite a gap. 30% from 80% is quite a big gap.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Council Member,
Mr. Burns.
in our project summaries, when we come to you with our business item with our recommendations for funding. The affordability strata will be presented. It's usually homeless, 0 to 30%, 30 to 50, 50 to 60, 60 to 80, and those breakdowns will be included in the summaries.
Thank you. Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Vento.
Mr. Chair, kind of piggybacking off of Councilmember Johnson's question about impact, I'm wondering if there are any statistics that cities are able to compile, particularly with programs like 6060 Dinah and the program that Paul Williams and
PPL.
yes, is involved with the American Indian Youth. If they ever have are able to measure the impact in terms of stability and how many those young people attendance in schools, as well as the length of time that families are spending in some of the residences. Is it creating the stability we want, or do we not know?
Mr. Burns.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, those are statistics that we're not tracking. I know many of the organizations that do that do keep those, and I've been to some of the grand openings of some of those projects, and it's just incredibly impacting to hear the stories, the individual stories that you hear from those youth that have been helped by those programs. It's really heartwarming and makes you feel like maybe we are helping a little bit. And I'm sure Libby will do a much better job talking about affordable housing than I could.
Further questions on Livable Communities overview, Councilmember Muse.
Any additional points for larger units?
For
larger
units.
Larger units, Mr. Chair, Councilmember. Yes, we do. Again, our housing staff will review apples and apples, not apples and oranges. So we frequently have a perception from smaller communities that they can't compete with Minneapolis and St. Paul. But when our staff, our subject matter expert staff, do their reviews, they review it based on that type of community. So some communities have a greater need for more projects with more bedrooms than others, and that is factored into their sort of community-specific review. And that's one of the things that we ask in our applications of what are the numbers of bedrooms that are included in the units.
Further questions? Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Burns, for the presentation.
Sure, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Council members, we'll move through the agenda into the business items. Our first business item is a change to the tax-based revitalization account grant to St. Paul Port Authority for the Major League Soccer Stadium complex. I'll ask Mr. Marcus Martin to present. Mr. Martin, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members of the committee, for putting this on your agenda today. I'm very pleased to present it. So today, Paul gave you kind of an overview of all the Livable Communities programs. I'm going to talk about just one of them, the tax-based revitalization account, and more specifically, the Major League Soccer complex. That includes the stadium and some surrounding areas, as we'll see here shortly. And we also have members of the applicant party here from the St. Paul Port Authority. So if I can't answer your question, I'm hopeful that someone will be able to.
Thank you.
All right. So starting out, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the grant. It was a $2.5 million grant that was awarded from the tax-based revitalization account program. The grant was to be used for environmental investigation, some limited demolition, contaminated soil remediation, and vapor mitigation. And all of that was to support the development of a soccer stadium, office space, 2 hotels, and some new retail space. There was additional funding that was committed by Metro Transit, and you'll see why here in a moment. So as a result of changes to the stormwater management system that we received a request from the Port Authority to amend the grant. So what we're asking to do is, or what the applicant rather is asking to do is update that project site boundary and change the scope of work, and we'll also be looking at the term of the grant. So I also want to give you a little bit of background on just our grant amendment process. So there are typically two types of grant requests. They can be administrative, which means they're at a level that staff can decide, or they can be considered significant, which means they have to come back to this committee. So defining what is considered significant, it depends a little bit on the type of amendment. There's just a couple kind of things that can happen. You can change the grant term. You can change where the, kind of the outline of where the project work is happening. You can kind of change the elements of the project itself. What kind of work is going to be done, and like what will be built afterwards. And then it really is also kind of how much change, of course, right? Sometimes those changes are quite small, and sometimes they're not. So in this case, the applicant requested a change in the project site. So we're going to be looking at the boundary, the scope of work, and a term extension. And an evaluation of these changes has led to changes in the expected outcomes associated with the grant. So let's start with the project site. All right. So shown here in this aerial map are changes to the project site boundary. So the area in red is the part that is excluded from the TBRA grant. That's the part that is owned by Metro Transit, affectionately known as the bus barn site. So Metro Transit contributed to the cleanup in that case. They contributed $3 million. So the Livable Communities grants are not going to that part of the site. The area around that in blue, that was the site of the TBRA grant when it was awarded back in 2016. And if you look at the yellow, that is the new proposed boundary. So if you combine the areas in yellow and red, that makes up the whole cleanup area. And that's the amendment to the cleanup plan for the first development phase for this whole project. So let's take a look at how that affected the development plan. So shown here is a site plan, a review of the revised site plan for the first development phase. So we are removing the hotels associated with Block G. So that's kind of on the east side there. And we're adding retail space within a part of Block D, which is north of the stadium. And we're updating kind of what those outcomes are for the retail, office, and hotel space in Block C on the west side of the stadium. All right. So thinking of all of that, how did that affect kind of the grant outcomes that we were expecting? So that resulted in a lower estimated amount of future tax base capacity, and also, but minimal changes to the future amount of jobs. So according to our grant policy, significant changes, in this case, what is significant is a decrease of over 20% of that expected tax base. That comes back and must be approved by this Community Development Committee. When we look at this, we are going to rescore those changes in the application to see how would this have been evaluated if we had known about this current version of the project at the time that we initially evaluated it. So in taking kind of that reduced number of that reduced tax base, a similar amount of jobs, had we known about these changes back in 2016, the revised outcomes would have competed well, and it would have been recommended by staff for funding to the Community Development Committee. So the $2 million increase, is still there. It's a decrease from what was there. It's still a very substantial increase. That's a large part of that finding. So with that, the proposed action for this committee is that the Community Development Committee approve a grant amendment changing the project site area, reducing the expected amount of commercial space and the associated tax base and jobs, revising the scope of work, extending the grant term by 2 years for the TBRA grant agreement, for the Major League Soccer Stadium complex awarded to the St. Paul Port Authority, and authorize our Community Development Division Director to amend the agreement on behalf of the council. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Questions on that report? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I understand it, because of the tremendous on-site stormwater management system, I think it sits under the Great Lawn. Am I correct?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, that's correct.
And that in part then, or in total, might be, if I'm reading right, what's driving some of this, because that then had to be captured within this boundary.
Mr. Martin.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, yes, that's right. We had to add that space. That was more cleanup was associated with that space that we hadn't anticipated because the stormwater was going to be located in a different part of the site earlier.
Councilmember Johnson.
And Mr. Chair, so it wasn't market conditions or anything, but it was because of the extra effort that was required to do water treatment on site, which, by the way, it's a pretty awesome facility underground. So if you ever want to read about that, it's pretty great. But that really is what's driving it. It's not market conditions or not knowing something at the beginning of the grant phase.
Mr. Martin.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, that's correct. The impetus for the change is the change to the stormwater.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions on that report? Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson.
Could you share a little more details about the type of difference in the number of jobs? Are we talking about, like, earlier it said it was not significant, but it's significant enough to mention here. So,
Mr. Martin.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee. So in this case, what we're finding is that there was a relocation of a lot of that planned commercial space. And so by adding commercial space in that northern part that originally was not considered part of the an area where there could be jobs, that contributed to kind of a very close net change, a very small net change is what I should say. So I think there was some retail jobs intended as part of the hotel space. Much of that space went to the north. Some of that space is still in the other side of the block in Block C.
so are we talking about
The question is how many jobs?
10 jobs, 100 jobs?
It was a 1% change.
Thank you. Yes. That's what I was looking
1%? I'm sorry.
1%.
Thank you.
for. Thank you.
Further questions on that report? Yeah, Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to double check, make sure that the Great Lawn area is staying there and nothing's changing about that, right?
Mr. Martin.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, no, I don't believe that would change at all. That is where the stormwater that was mentioned, that was where the location of the underground stormwater retention tanks to be able to access those and service those in the future. It's very important to have that space there. It's also seen as a community amenity in the master plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further questions? Further questions? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to approve the grant amendment, changing the project site area, revising the scope of work and extending the grant term, and authorize the Community Development Division Director to amend the grant agreement on our behalf. I will note this committee has the final authority over this action. This will not be forwarded to the Met Council for approval.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. And discussion on that motion? Discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Thank you, Mr. Mark, for your work on this
for your time.
presentation. We'll move on to our other business item today. This is a joint committee item. It's our first comprehensive plan of the 2040 comprehensive plans. The city of Newport. Mr. Bolin is not here with us, so Ms. Angela Torres will present. Ms. Torres, welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Torres, the Manager of Local Planning Assistance in the Community Development Division. I want to give a brief refresh of some of the key points from last week's Committee of the Whole meeting, and then I will go into the Newport presentation, if that's okay. As a reminder of the 168 plans that we have to review, only 7 have been authorized, so all of the other 161 plans will come through this committee. A large majority of that will be in 2019. I talked last week about some of the required plan components that you will see described in your staff reports for the comp plans. There are several specific required plan components that's directed by the Metropolitan Land Planning Act. Those are in the visual there. I did describe those last week. You'll see each of these described in the staff report for all of the comprehensive plans. The council's review authority is based in statute. There are different review standards based on the component that we are reviewing. The council authorizes plans to be put into effect. We don't have the council doesn't have the ability to approve or deny, but we review and comment, with the exception of the comprehensive sewer plan, because that has a direct impact on our system. The plans must be in conformance with the council's 3 system plans: transportation, which includes highways, transit, and light rail, regional parks and trails, and the wastewater system and the infrastructure investments involved in that system. Plans must be consistent with the council's regional policies like natural resources, housing, and water supply. We advise communities on issues of consistency and then eligibility for incentive programs like LCA may be impacted with consistency issues. We work very hard to work with communities to bring plans into consistency with council policies as well. Plans must be compatible with plans of affected and adjacent jurisdictions, and the council works to facilitate at times where compatibility issues between plans might be an issue. We can also, in certain circumstances, and in actually very rare circumstances, require modifications to plans. Those are only in relation to the conformance issues related to the 3 system plans, and that process is outlined again very specifically in statute. The official review process is 120 calendar days. Council has to review and take action on comp plans as well as any amendments to those plans. I'll speak specifically about plan updates because that's what we're largely going to be referring to. The community will submit a plan, initiates a 15 business day review period. Again, that's a statutory timeline, and communities might be really familiar with that as their development proposals at the local level are often in that same timeline, right? We respond within that time frame unless the community submits supplemental information, which can then give you an additional 15 business days. But we really work with communities throughout this process to answer any questions, help them get to completeness, any incomplete items. And then from the date of submittal, once the plan is determined to be complete, we initiate that through the council's committee process. And we have a complete 120 days to do all of that review. It takes about 10 days once it's determined to be complete to facilitate the development of the staff report, and then we prepare to present at committee meetings. This is a general timeline, and at times it can flip. For example, with Newport, you may know that the Environment Committee reviewed that last week, and the Community Development Committee, obviously today, is reviewing Newport. So here's the schedule for Newport. Like I said, Environment Committee reviewed this last week. The CDC then makes recommendations to the council to authorize the community or the county to place its 2040 comp plan into effect. And we also advise them to revise items like forecast community designations or other changes to council policies or the plans as necessary. We do advise the community or the county to address other comments in the staff report, and you'll see that in today's report as well, where they have advisory comments for land use, housing, etc. Following the council's final action on the plan, the community will need to make any changes and adopt a final plan at the local level by resolution, and then they resubmit that to us, to the council. And then I'm happy to take any questions on this part of it before I go into actual Newport's 2040 comp plan.
Any questions for Ms. Torres? Questions? Seeing none, Ms. Torres.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. At this time, I would normally segue into an introduction to the sector rep and principal reviewer, Patrick Boylan, but as the chair mentioned, he's out of the office, so I'll give Newport.
And Ms. Torres, if I may, I see that Councilmember Turner has joined us. I know Bayport is in his district, and so he's welcome to join in the conversation. Of course, he won't be voting on it, but you're welcome to join us if you like, Councilmember. Thank you. Ms. Torres, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
Newport is located in southwest Washington County. It's surrounded by the communities of St. Paul, Maplewood, Woodbury, Cottage Grove, St. Paul Park, Amber Grove Heights, and South St. Paul. This map shows the regional systems for the community. You can see I-94, US Highway 61, and then regional interceptor and meter station, as well as the planned BRT transit way along Highway 61. Thrive MSP 2040 has designated the city as urban. During the development of the local plan, the city initiated discussions with council staff regarding a change to their community designation from urban to suburban. Future residential development densities in portions of the city are significantly limited by the existing steep slopes, the geography of the Mississippi River bluff, lakes, and shoreland areas, as shown in Figure 3. In addition, there are significant market and accessibility differences between the river area of the city and the areas of the river bluff, which make it difficult to attain an overall net density of 10 units per acre as required for urban communities. The city provided data to support their position, and council staff agreed. Council staff find that the city's request to change its community designation to be reasonable. Council staff in community development and environmental services are supportive of the designation change from urban to suburban. The Environment Committee heard the argument on Tuesday, March 26th, and raised no objections. Between
Ms. Torres, I'm sorry to interrupt. A question from Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. So Newport is actually in my district, and
Oh, I apologize.
it's
Councilmember.
that's fine. It's I have it's it's a basic question, and not being not having a legal background, is the designation is that a some kind of legal or political maneuver to what's can you explain that?
Oh, it's Ms. Barajas, I think, has a response, is it?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Council Member, the designations are ones that the council created in the development of Thrive MSP 2040. The council always uses community designations in some form to help ensure that the broader regional policies actually fit the community. So in previous iterations of our regional development guides, like the 2030 Regional Development Framework and others, we use different designations. In Thrive MSP 2040, we used a more analysis-based approach with geographic information systems where we could do all sorts of analysis around existing development patterns, intersection density, age of housing, and a number of other things to actually group like communities with like communities. Some communities fell on the edge, could be in one or the other, and so through the planning process, both through Thrive public comment period and through the planning process, we asked communities that we thought were kind of on an edge to consider that of what designations best fit their existing development patterns, because the expectations for different communities are different. In this case, or community designations, I should say. In this case, the designation, as Angela had noted, their request for change made a lot of sense. If you visited Newport, you know they've got a pretty steep bluff that splits their community to the east of the highway there, and the upper portion up above the bluff is considerably low density, has some large natural areas, and isn't currently served with wastewater services either. Getting up the bluff is almost impossible, so with wastewater service, and so looks for partnerships with surrounding communities to the east to help serve that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember. Ms. Torres. Oh, I'm sorry. That's his name. Councilmember Wolf and then Councilmember Shines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would add that there were a number of communities that adjusted their designations earlier, some before Thrive was ever even published, and then others along the way. It's not an unusual thing at all to be kind of in between designations and even get into the planning process and realize, wait, this doesn't quite fit. We need to switch to another one. There's no, strategery or anything in trying to game the system by changing your designation.
Thank you. Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you, Chair. My question is along those lines to understand a little bit about um, the impact of a designation change. Is there an impact in terms of less requirements to, fulfill a requirement, or is there, what is the advantage of moving from urban to suburban or suburban to urban?
Ms. Torres.
Chair and committee members, I wouldn't say there's an advantage or not. It depends on the needs of the community, but it's largely based on minimum density requirements. So for an urban community, there's a minimum density of 10 units per acre. For suburban community, that minimum density is 5 units per acre.
And Ms. Barajas has something to add.
Mr. Chair, I would also add, Councilmember Chambliss, that the forecasted growth for the community remains the same. The expectations around its amount of support for their affordable housing need allocation is the same. It's just the density piece that would change for them. So all other things remain the same.
Okay, so if there is a change in density, does that impact planning for development?
Ms. Torres?
Chair and committee members, there is change in that development pattern. An urban community looks different than a suburban community. However, there are areas within the community around the BRT station, for example, where higher densities are still required. And so there's a balance in providing a community the option through their planning process to have different types and densities of development throughout their community and still be served with urban services and provide access to things like transit.
Okay, thank you. That did help.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further questions, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so because of this designation change, the original designation, was that worked with city staff originally, and it was just kind of a joint realization that as future redevelopment and development continued, that it wouldn't be achievable? Or was it kind of determined by staff that this is your designation, and then as the comp plans come in and move forward, then it's determined through topography and, taking out wetlands and all of the things that locals do? Is that when it was determined that it should be a different designation?
Ms. Torres.
Chair and committee members, for this particular one, I believe that was the case where through the planning process, they identified that our needs are changing and it's not practical for the densities required and to be accommodated in this type of community designation. There are other instances where that may happen earlier in the process. As Council Member Wolf was mentioning, sometimes during the Thrive process, for example, we were engaging with communities and many designations changed at that time. As communities got into their planning process, I think a few more will identify that their designation may not fit and would request a change. They do that then through making that request in their plan and changing the elements within their plan to fit that new designation, always framing that in the council needs to review and authorize that to be a change.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do appreciate that. I think it acknowledges the partnership with the locals, respecting the local control, but still understanding that there's a regional plan that we're all working to. But I like that partnership element. Locals appreciate that as well.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's also important to understand that not every community follows closely what we do. There are some that have a lot of staff that's their job is to watch us, and some of us don't talk to us. Some of them don't talk to us very much, and so they might find something out later in their process. It doesn't mean that they're doing anything wrong. They just aren't as connected into what we're doing on a day-to-day basis as some of the other communities.
Thank you. Any further questions? Ms. Wolf, or Ms. Torres, rather, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. So between 2020 and 2040, the council forecasts that the city will grow by 850 in population, representing 570 households, and an increase of 110 jobs. Table 2 from the staff report illustrates the planned residential density for the city. The overall density for guided residential land is expected to be between 6.3 and 21.5 units per acre. Communities with a suburban designation under Thrive are expected to plan for forecasted population and household growth at average densities of at least 5 units per acre for new and redevelopment. Newport's plan exceeds this policy.
Ms. Torres, question from Councilmember Bento.
Can you go back to table 1? That isn't included there.
Yeah, that's not in our slide.
That's not in our
It's not,
slides,
yeah.
so just
Chair and committee members, I apologize for
That's
that
okay.
oversight. It is in your staff report, so I hope that you can reference it from there, and we will make sure that that's changed in the template. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
The city is planning for dense commercial and residential uses along the planned VRT corridor. The station area is guided at 20 to 15 dwelling units per acre. With review of the plan, it conforms to system plans, is consistent with council policies, with the proposed community designation modification to suburban, and the plan is compatible with the plans of adjacent communities and affected jurisdictions. On March 26th, the Environmental Services staff presented to the Environment Committee. The committee reviewed and unanimously approved the city's comprehensive sewer plan component of the city's 2040 comprehensive plan. In the staff report, the committee is asked to consider the following actions for the Metropolitan Council: to authorize the City of Newport to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, revise the community designation for the city from urban to suburban in Thrive MSP 2040. Council is also asked to advise the city to send the data to the city that the city adopts, send the date that the city adopts its local water management plan to the council, adopt the Mississippi River Corridor critical area component of their 2040 comprehensive plan within 60 days after receiving final approval from the DNR, and submit a copy of the final adopted plan and evidence of adoption to the DNR Council and National Park Service within 10 days after the adoption, and implement the advisory comments to the reviewed record for transportation, surface water management, land use, and housing. With that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Torres. Any questions on that report? Councilmember Cummings.
So when the plans are out for review by neighboring communities, do they ever get negative in changing from urban to suburban? Are there any comments from the neighboring communities on that?
Ms. Torres.
Chair and committee members, the adjacent communities and affected jurisdictions are given 6 months to review their plans. They are asked to provide either written comments within that 6-month period or advise the communities that they have no comments. Those comments are expected to be responded to prior to submitting that plan to us. And so if there are any comments, they have been addressed. I don't know of any concerns that were raised regarding the community designation change in particular. I believe that it would have been in the staff report if that would have been the case.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Johnson.
And just a process question. I'll figure this out eventually. But it went to the Environment Committee, then it's coming to us. Does it go to any of the other Transportation Committee or Parks Review?
Ms. Torres.
Chair and committee member, no. It only goes to Environment Committee if the community has a wastewater treatment system, and otherwise everything comes through community development. It doesn't go to the other communities, but it will go to the council at large following the Community Development Committee's recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
I'm just could you provide a little more background about the request for them to adopt the Mississippi River Corridor critical area component and transportation? Like, how does that fit into the rest of what we heard about today?
Ms. Torres.
Sure. Okay, so I'll go back to the slide so we can refer to it. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Chair, Councilmember. Um, the there are plan components within the larger comprehensive plan that we coordinate with other state agencies, and the Mississippi River Corridor, sorry, MERCA, is one of those things, and that actually is approved by the DNR. We have the authority again to review and comment. So once it is approved by the DNR and the changes have been made requested by the DNR to that plan, they incorporate that into their comprehensive plan, and then we are able to consider that plan complete and can then move it through that process. It's one of the other many state agency coordination efforts that we do as part of the overall comprehensive plan process.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you. Further questions on the report? Seeing none, I'd entertain the motion recommended by staff to authorize the City of Newport to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, to revise the community designation and the 3 points that we're advising the city on. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded and is before us. Is there any discussion on the motion? Discussion. Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Thank you, Ms. Torres.
Thank you.
And council members, we'll move on to the final item on our agenda for today, and that's a presentation from Libby Starling on the council roles in housing. Ms. Starling, welcome.
Mr. Chair, council members, as the last item on your agenda today, my name is Libby Starling. I am the Deputy Director of the Community Development Division. And in the ongoing quest of communicating everything that the Community Development Division does, I get to give you an overview and an introduction to the council's housing policy. And as with everything, you have already heard pieces of this. There's already been discussion earlier in today's meeting, so there is no good linear way of capturing everything in one linear before the other piece. So apologies for the ongoing circularity of these ongoing conversations. So in my time with you today, I'm hoping to get through a number of different pieces in this overview of the council's housing policy, starting with some of the questions that already came up earlier in this meeting about how we define affordable housing, understanding the housing ecosystem, looking at different roles within this, looking at government, looking at funders, looking at the council, and then really leaning into some of the council's roles in housing policy, including the 2040 Housing Policy Plan, which you should all have in front of you, our work reviewing local comprehensive plans, as you just heard in the Newport example, Livable Communities, which you heard about earlier in this meeting, incentives for housing performance, and then some conversation about technical assistance and some of the softer roles of the council roles. So that's what I'm hoping to get through without keeping you here until 8 o'clock. So housing is a complex area. With the chair's approval, I'd be happy to take questions as they come throughout this, because my goal is to help you understand all of this complexity of these many pieces. So first of all, when we talk about affordable housing, the overall definition that we think about is that a household is spending no more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. And when we're looking at this, we're looking at the gross income. So we're not looking at net in terms of taxes. And that's leaving 70% of their household income for everything other than housing, whether that's transportation, whether that's healthcare, whether that's childcare, whether that's food. You're putting affordable in quotation marks for the simple reason that even at this level, it may not feel like it's affordable. But in this, we're trying to set an overall threshold for determining what we're calling affordable and what we're not calling affordable, just for argument's sake. So it could be that there is a household that is spending only 25% of their income on housing, and it may feel unaffordable. But in this, we're setting a threshold for conversation. So we're using the standard 30% of household income as that overall threshold.
Ms. Starling, in the spirit of asking questions as we go, question from Councilmember Vento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Starling, the 30%, is that a council identified figure or is that based on federal policy?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, 30% is a common threshold. Households that are spending more than 30% are considered to be housing cost burdened. This is also similar to what you've heard from similar to the thresholds that the Metro HRA uses, similar to what many mortgage companies use in terms of determining what is affordable. So this is by no means only the council's threshold, but this is a standard common definition.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Starling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then the other piece, so 30% of income. And then the next piece is to think about which households we are most paying the most attention to in terms of thresholds of area median income. The area median income, or AMI, if you will accept the acronym, is set by the federal government. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development sets the area median income based on census data on a yearly basis for a family of 4. All of these are set by various family sizes, but what is before you on the slide is the area median income for a family of 4. So in 2018, $94,300 was determined to be the area median income. So for a family of 4, half are earning more than that, half are earning less than that. Then when we're looking at which households are considered to be of low income, that's where we get to the threshold that we're really paying attention to of 60% of area median income. Overall, in terms of how we count affordable units under the Livable Communities program, we do look at up to an 80% area median income threshold. But when we're talking about how many new affordable units are built in the region, for example, we're really focusing on households earning up to that 60% area median income threshold. So that would be $56,000, just to give you a sense of that. Or for a single wage earner, that would be $27.20 an hour, assuming one wage earner in this household. So in housing, there's a lot of conversation about are units affordable at 60% of the area median income, at 30% of area median income. When we're looking overall, we're really focusing on that 60% and below. There's some of our policies do go up to an 80% threshold, and then there are priorities for units at 30% of area median income. So there's a multifaceted complex conversation in this, but this is just an overall marker for this. So when you're translating these income levels into what low-income households can afford, when we're looking at the 60% of area median income threshold for a 2-bedroom, that translates to a monthly rent of $1,273. For a 4-bedroom, that would be over $1,600 a month in rent. For an efficiency, $991 a month in rent. So this is what these thresholds translate into. When we look at that at the 30% area median income threshold, we see that that affordability level drops with the income. So for a 2-bedroom, we'd be looking at $636. For a 4-bedroom, $820, efficiency $495. So just for overall context, that's what these income levels translate into on a monthly rent level. And then we also translate these into what home prices are, because some of our Livable Communities dollars do fund home ownership opportunities. So for a household at 80% AMI, we're saying that a unit at $234,500 meets that. Going down 60%, 50% would be $149,000. And then for a household earning 30% of area median income, that would translate into a home price of $83,500.
Question from Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Chair, Ms. Starling, one question, just because I want to make sure I got this right from our earlier conversation with Mr. Burns. The Met Council defines affordable as 80% AMI, or was it, yeah. 80% AMI could be considered an affordable housing?
Ms. Starling.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Atlas Ingerbritsen, there's no universal single. So when we're counting affordable units for some of the Livable Communities programs, some of those do come in at 80% AMI. Some also come in at 30% AMI. When we're counting, and going back to your question, in the summaries that come forward, we're tracking what the affordability of those units are. When we're looking at how we count the number of units that are added, we count at multiple levels, but report on 60% of area median income and below. In the allocation of need that's talked about in our housing policy plan, that goes up to 80%. So there are different levels that we're looking at in different places.
Chair, Ms. Starling, could you, I'm curious, because it just would be nice to see, it would be nice to see what the monthly rents would look at if it was 80% AMI, which would be possible through something funded by the Met Council and would qualify as affordable housing. It would be quite a bit higher than what's here. I'm not great at that type of math. Although I'm good at other types of math, I'm not great at that type of math. So I'm just curious, because that helps to give like a realistic understanding of what someone would be looking at. $1,600 in rent for a family of 4 is something, but we'd be talking about something quite a bit higher than that.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Atlas Ingerbritsen, as a general marker, it would be about 1/3 more than what you're looking at here. I'd be happy to send out those numbers to committee members.
I can do that math.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I should know this. So when we look at the home prices, so that's the home price. Does that take into does that factor into mortgage amounts or programs that they're using to purchase the homes, down payments? I'm assuming that's not the mortgage amount.
Ms. Starling.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, the numbers that are on this slide, we do an annual calculation looking at what the area median income levels were in the previous slide, and then looking at assumptions about what mortgage interest rates are, what general overall regional assumptions are about property tax rates, what insurance, and assumptions about what a down payment might be, so that the numbers are here are the home prices that with generous assumptions about what a household could expect to get, that these would be affordable.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilmember. Other questions? Ms. Starling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with that, moving into how we think about the overall housing continuum. So the first piece of the housing continuum is publicly subsidized or income restricted housing. So these are units that have been financed with some sort of public funding. It might include public housing. These are the ones where households must earn no more than a certain income level in order to live in these units. So thinking about housing units financed using low-income housing tax credits, some of the units that are funded through Livable Communities. These are generally owned, sometimes operated by public nonprofits, sometimes private developers, but these have very strict restrictions on which households can live in these units because of the restrictions on funding. The largest source of affordable housing in our region are the naturally occurring affordable housing. Sometimes you've heard the acronym NOAA units, naturally occurring affordable housing. These are units that have generally aged into affordability. These are the Class B or Class C units that do not have any public subsidy in them. They do not have income restrictions about who can live there. So some portion of the people who live there would qualify for publicly subsidized housing. Other people who live in these units that have lower rent or lower mortgage costs are those who have much higher incomes but are choosing to live in these units because they don't want higher housing costs. The naturally occurring affordable housing generally accepts housing choice vouchers, but does not always accept housing choice vouchers. So this is more of a mixed market because there's very little public subsidy or public assistance in this area. But this is by far the region's largest source of existing affordable housing. And then the final piece of this is market rate housing. So this is what's affordable to households earning at least 80% of the area median income or above. And so when Mr. Burns talked about livable communities, we've certainly financed a lot of affordable units, but we also have money that has helped produce market rate units in different parts of the region. When we finance this, then we do say that you are expected to accept housing choice vouchers, but overall in the private market, some do accept housing choice vouchers, as you've heard from Ms. Smith previously, some do not accept housing choice vouchers, so this is an overall piece. When we're talking about affordable housing, that's really the first two pieces of this. So looking at the publicly subsidized and that naturally occurring affordable housing. So the upper two pieces of this overall housing continuum. And then when we think about some of the public roles in the housing ecosystem, there's both the policy dimension as well as the funding dimension that comes from different levels. So thinking about the federal government from a policy dimension has the Fair Housing Act. And then there are a number of different sources that come from the federal government, whether that's the Community Development Block Grant Program, Housing Choice Vouchers, Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. Coming down to the state government, the state legislature has a key role in granting powers around housing or limiting authorities around housing. So thinking about the Land Planning Act that governs how the council works with local comprehensive planning, thinking about the prohibition on cities having rent control. So there's a range of powers and authorities that come from the state legislature. At the state level, Minnesota Housing, the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, is the largest funder of affordable housing through programs like their Challenge program, the Housing Trust Fund. It's also important to note that the low-income housing tax credit flows down to the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency in about half of our region, and then other parts of it flow down to other levels. Housing choice vouchers flow to the council as the state's largest administrator of housing choice vouchers. We also have the Livable Communities Act funds that Mr. Burns talked about. In terms of our policy role, it's really our role around comprehensive plan review. And then counties have a role in this. Counties are generally responsible for doing the consolidated plan to access community development block grant funding from the federal government. Counties also have community development agencies. They also have HRA levies. And in many cases, counties are the administrator of housing choice vouchers, and in some cases, also the administrator of community development block grant funds, as well as low-income housing tax credits. This is a very complicated system we have here. And then finally, cities are responsible for land use and zoning. Many have an HRA levy, Housing and Redevelopment Authority levy. They have local ordinances that set the table for housing responsibilities. And then on a funding level, cities are the ones who are responsible for tax increment financing, determining when to give that. Some have Housing and Redevelopment Authority or Economic Development Authority levies and local housing bonds. And in some cases, cities are the ones who are responsible for housing choice vouchers, community development block grant funds, as well as in some cases, local low-income housing tax credits. So we have a lot of public roles in the housing ecosystem that are all trying to work together to advance what we hope are common goals around expanding housing. When we think about how development happens, the key piece is thinking about the different roles between developers, funders, and cities. So starting from the bottom, cities really have the roles around land use planning and zoning, and they're trying to balance regional needs with the desires of what happens at the neighborhood level. And then we see the interplay between developers and funders where there's a back and forth flow between funding and expectations, whether that is public funding sources or private funding sources. In some cases, accepting public funding brings with it specific requirements about which income levels are prioritized, which types of households. In accepting private funding, developers are making agreements about what types of profit expectations or what types of housing will be built. So there's an ongoing back and forth between the finance community, the developer, within the overall context of the city, who in some cases may be playing the role of the landowner, may be playing the role of the developer, may be playing the role of a funder. So this is a high-level version of a very complicated system that we have before us. So with that background, I want to jump into the council's roles in housing. So you've already heard Terry Smith talk about the council's Metro HRA, so our role in providing rental assistance to low-income households. But then as we think about some of the other roles, and I'll go through these all in more detail, providing data and analysis to understand the housing market, defining local government shares of the regional need for low-income housing, reviewing local comprehensive plans, funding housing development, providing incentives for housing performance, and providing technical assistance, and then collaborating with and convening partners to expand the regional housing dialogue. So when you think about the council's roles, this is kind of the overall umbrella for the pieces that I'll go into more detail on. So the first thing I want to highlight as a council role is simply providing data and analysis about what's happening in the region around housing. So we do produce an annual report that documents how many new affordable housing units are added to the region as a whole, in which cities, at what affordability levels. We look at the current supply of affordable housing across the region, and with this provide an existing housing assessment to every city to inform their local comprehensive planning process that lays out where different levels of affordability now are, where low-income households now live, and beginning to lay out where there's a mismatch between where job growth is occurring and where housing is occurring. So really a fundamental piece is helping the region understand what's going on in the regional housing market. Then I want to call out our work on the housing policy plan. The housing policy plan was put together between 2012 and 2014. It was adopted in December 2014 as the council's first freestanding housing policy plan since 1985. So the overall policy priority that is laid out in the housing policy plan is to create housing options that give people in all life stages and of all economic means viable choices for safe, stable, and affordable housing. So really leaning into how do we grow the level of housing choices and options that our region's households can benefit from. So I encourage you all to take this home and use it as bedtime reading or perhaps a doorstop. So part of what the housing policy plan lays out in detail is what goes into the housing elements of local comprehensive plans. And so there are three big pieces that go into the housing elements of comprehensive plans. And all of these are coming out of what the statutory requirements are that are laid out in the Land Planning Act. So the first piece of this is to provide adequate housing opportunities to meet existing and projected local and regional housing needs. So existing and projected housing needs. The second is that cities are using land use planning to promote the availability of land for the development of low and moderate income housing, so beginning to look out into the future. And then the final piece is that cities are expected to identify tools to implement the land use plan housing element that will meet the local unit's share of the metropolitan area need for low and moderate income housing. So taking this into how the council reviews housing elements into these pieces, in looking at the existing housing need, we're expecting cities and townships to include a narrative analysis of how they're understanding their existing housing assessment, to clearly identify existing housing needs, and to clearly prioritize existing housing needs. So taking on, with the data that the council provides them, or additional data to demonstrate that they're understanding the housing needs in their community. Then looking at projected housing need, which gets into the allocation of affordable housing need that I'll go into on the next slide, and that's detailed in the housing policy plan. And then that there's an implementation program that in order to be consistent with the council's housing policy, that the plan clearly and directly acknowledges all widely accepted tools that address stating needs and address the sequence and circumstances in which each tool would be considered. So getting into the overall housing implementation program. Now, going back to the second piece of projected housing need, this is what we call the allocation of affordable housing need that's laid out in extensive detail in the housing policy plan. And this gets to the statutory responsibility of cities to plan for projected housing need. And you may have heard about this from some of your cities where every city has 3 numbers. So to get to those 3 numbers, we have forecast that the region as a whole will need a bit over 37,000 new affordable housing units between 2021 and 2030. So that's the regional need. And then we're making some local adjustments so that we're allocating that need on the basis of how much our cities forecast to grow, as you saw in the Newport Comprehensive Plan earlier today. So making the share of new housing proportional to overall forecasted housing growth. We're making adjustments on the basis of how much existing affordable housing a city already has. And we're making an adjustment on the basis of the ratio of low-wage jobs to low-wage workers that are in the community and within a radius of that community. And then, so that gets an overall number of need for each city. And then we adjust that further so that each city has a need within 3 affordability bands. So up to 30% of area median income, from 31% to 50% of area median income, and from 51 to 80% of area median income. So as you look in, let me give you a page number, starts on page 164 of the housing policy plans that are before you is the overall number of need. And then the aggregation into the 3 affordability bands starts on page 170 of the housing policy plan that is before you. And so when cities are planning for their projected housing need, they're expected to plan for the availability of land for the development of low and moderate income housing. Generally, we're expecting them to guide enough land at least 8 units per acre that new development can meet this need over the 2021 to 2030 time period. There is another option where they can guide land at 12 units an acre and at 6 units an acre as a different way of meeting this. Most, though not all, cities and townships seem to be choosing to guide land at 8 units an acre. So when cities are talking about affordable housing need in the context of their comprehensive plan, they're looking at these numbers that are laid out in the housing policy plan on an ongoing basis. And this is a key piece of the comp plan review reviews that are coming before you.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Bento.
If this is a question that isn't best suited for now and you want to deal with it separately, I'm happy to do that. But just a hypothetical. I live in a townhome, just to be clear, but let's pretend that I have own 2 acres of property in Maplewood, Minnesota, undeveloped, and I decide I want to sell this. If the city is kind of under the gun to do more development for affordable housing, do they have priority in buying my land?
Ms. Starling.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, in terms of this is all part of the comprehensive plan. So this is how the land is guided in the comprehensive plan, and then ultimately how that land is zoned. So all of the issues of ownership happen really outside of that planning process.
So to be clear, it happens at the city level, or does the council have a role in any way in terms of influencing that zoning?
Ms. Starling.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, all of the council's influence over this happens through the vehicle of the comprehensive plan.
Okay.
So Every city is given the allocation of need, or I will say, every city that has sewer serviced household growth is given the allocation of need. And then in their comprehensive planning process, cities are deciding which land to guide in a way at densities that they can meet that need.
Thank you. Ms. Barajas, and then I'll go to Councilmember Wolf.
I just add, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just add to that, under the Metropolitan Land Planning Act, cities are required to update their zoning ordinances within 9 months of adopting their comprehensive plans. So that's also part of the action that you take in reviewing comp plans, is reminding communities of that responsibility. One of the things that's part of the housing implementation plan is also to consider in what sequence or under what circumstances certain tools a city may use, and that includes rezoning. So it's not always a one-for-one automatic change on the zoning side. And then to your earlier question about do cities basically have the right to buy your property first? Essentially, what development happens locally is kind of on the open market, and cities are not compelled to actually develop the land themselves either. Land Planning Act only lays out requirements for what's required in local plans.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to clarify that those density numbers don't require that the land be developed into affordable housing. It could be developed at any high density housing use. It just makes it possible for it to be developed as affordable housing.
Further questions? Ms. Starling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So moving on to some of the other pieces. You already heard earlier today from Mr. Burns about the Livable Communities Act programs, but there are a few pieces of this that I want to highlight specifically in the context of Council's housing policy. The first piece is that access to the Livable Communities Act programs is only possible for cities and townships that are consistent with the Council's housing policy. So cities that are not consistent with housing policy in their comprehensive plans are not eligible to participate in the Livable Communities Act programs. The second piece I want to highlight is that following up on a recommendation that was in the 2040 Housing Policy Plan, as of 2019, cities and townships must have adopted a fair housing policy in order to access Livable Communities Act funds. So we are now seeing a flurry of cities that are adopting fair housing policies at the local level so that they can draw down Livable Communities Act funds that they may have been awarded in 2018. So this is an instance of the council using its incentive authority to encourage cities to take on local action. And then the final piece I want to call out and re-emphasize from what you saw from Mr. Burns is that in order to participate in the Livable Communities Act programs, cities must adopt affordable and life cycle housing goals. This will be an action that you will be looking at probably in 2020, is working with cities on the goals for that 2021 to 2030 time period. So the need numbers are in the housing policy plan, and the need numbers are what cities are putting into their local comprehensive plans. How the council will negotiate goals with cities around how many units will be developed is a conversation that will occur most likely in 2020. But the goals and the need numbers in comprehensive plans are often confused, but are actually different numbers. So for the 2011 to 2020 decade, there is a need that cities put into their 2030 comprehensive plans, and then a goal that was a different number that was negotiated with the council in order to access Livable Communities Act funds for the current decade. So they're slightly different pieces, but they both have numbers and so are often confused. Then a next broad piece of the council's housing policy is what I broadly think of as providing incentives for housing performance. Mr. Burns mentioned the council's housing performance scores. And so every year the council calculates a housing performance score for cities and townships across the region that looks at their performance in creating and preserving affordable housing. This is a 0 to 100 point scale. Half of those points are for new construction and preservation of affordable housing. 25 for the characteristics of the existing housing stock. For example, how much of that is affordable? And then 25 points are for local housing programs, whether that is a local mixed income housing policy, whether that is for a local housing tax levy, whether that is for local partnerships around down payment assistance. There's a tremendous range of local housing programs that we see across the city. And so cities receive points on those. So every year, the council calculates a housing performance score from 0 to 100. That is then used in Livable Communities programs for projects or cities that are coming in requesting affordable housing. For those, a lower housing performance score gets preference. Otherwise, it's cities with a higher housing performance score that get the preference. And then the housing performance score has also represented 7% of the total points for the regional solicitation for federal transportation funds that flows through the Transportation Advisory Board and the council. So those are the two main uses of the council's housing performance scores.
Ms. Starling, question from Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Starling. How do community groups and nonprofit groups who are closer to the community and the ground, who kind of do activism around affordable housing issues, how do they interface with our performance scores and our processes? Because if communities get these grants to do these projects, how do we ensure that community voice gets involved and it doesn't just gentrify a neighborhood as it comes through? And with all due respect to all who we are as government employees and policymakers, I think that sometimes nonprofit folks and folks in the community have a better understanding of the needs of the community than sometimes we do.
Ms. Starling.
Mr. Chair, council members, I think the key piece of what you're asking about is community engagement in the development of projects that are receiving funding from the Council for Livable Communities Act grants. And this is an area that we are currently seeing some growth in the level of community engagement that happens in the project development process and in the grant applications that come to us for Livable Communities Act funding. So in the last few years, we've seen a notable increase in community voices in putting together those project proposals. And to help encourage that, the council is putting on an engagement workshop in early May specifically to help give developers more skills in how to do more effective community engagement throughout the project development process in such a way that the projects that come to us for funding have stronger community grounding in the project proposal stage as the project develops.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Vento.
Mr. Chair, Starling, would it be possible for this committee and perhaps all of the council members to either have the opportunity to participate in that workshop as observers or to get a mini version at a committee of the whole session?
Ms. Starling.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, information about that workshop has been in the chair's daily report. And so I would encourage you to follow up on that. And then certainly if there's interest in having some sort of version at whether this committee or a future committee of the whole or council meeting, that's certainly possible.
Councilmember.
Mr. Chair, just to clarify, is it appropriate for us to attend a workshop like that as council members?
Starling.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, you're certainly welcome and encouraged to.
Thank you. Further questions from Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson.
Thank you, Chair. Could you share who's leading or conducting that training for the developers? Is it council staff or consultants or a mixture?
Ms. Starling.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson. Mr. Burns has those names.
Mr. Burns.
Mr. Chair, council members, I don't have the names in memory, but we have council staff and council engagement staff have been putting this together. We're bringing in, actually one of the presenters is a member of our Livable Communities Advisory Committee who has also done projects where they've gone out and held focus groups with the target population. A couple other folks have been they're experts in community engagement, and we're really excited about this and really looking forward to it. Again, it's not just council staff, but it's people that have experience in very direct, active engagement beyond the hold a public meeting and here's what we're going to do and what do you think. So we're very excited about this and hope to continue to do this in the future.
Councilmember Atlas Inglewood.
Just, it'd be great to find out if you could share who the specific people are. That would be wonderful.
Mr. Chair, yes, we can
Burns.
send out that notice to the committee members. But again, as Libby said, it's in the chair's daily report, and those names are listed in the chair's daily report.
It is. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The community engagement leaders are James Garrett, Alexa Golemo of McAllister Groveland Community Council, Avi Viswanathan of the Community Engagement Institute Nexus Community Partners, Olivia Levins Holden, Community Resilience Organizer for Hope Community, and Hannah Gary, Ryan Kelly, and Marcus Martin from the Livable Communities staff, Claudia Fuentes from Communications staff, Amanda Lovely from our Parks staff.
Thank you, Councilmember. Thank you. Ms. Starling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the final piece is just thinking about the council's role in what I think of as the soft dimensions of influence in what's happening in the region in terms of housing. So some of this is the technical assistance that staff provide to cities in putting together the housing elements of local comprehensive plans. So lots of one-on-one assistance to get cities to local comprehensive plans that are consistent with the council's housing policy. We host workshops on affordable housing, and this is a range, whether it's workshops on how to put together a local comprehensive plan that is consistent with the council's housing policy, or at the end of February, we held a workshop on affordable home ownership to help city staff understand what a community land trust looks like, to understand what opportunities are around Habitat for Humanity, talking about manufactured housing, so looking at the range of affordable home ownership in a way that many cities, particularly those without dedicated housing staff, did not fully understand what the opportunities were. We spent time talking about correcting myths about affordable housing in ongoing conversation. We have occasionally been in the role of connecting cities that might say, maybe it might be time for us to develop affordable housing, to affordable housing developers that in some cases have said, you know, we were about to reach out to that city. And so the council is occasionally in the role of matchmaker in such a way of connecting cities to affordable housing developers so that affordable housing development can occur. You may have seen that in the last few years, there's been a rise in interest in cities that have adopted mixed income housing policies. A few years ago, the council partnered with others to put together a feasibility calculator on mixed income housing in such a way that a city can assess if a specific housing project would pencil out if the city asked for a certain number of units in a project to be affordable, as such a way of correcting some of the power balance that we see between cities and developers. Because too often the conversation has happened, a developer says, I'm sorry, I can't do affordable units, it doesn't pencil out. And city staff have not always had the knowledge base or capacity to be able to say, wait, actually, we think that there is a profit margin that still exists with this. So again, investing in the capacity of cities across the region, particularly those that have less dedicated housing staff. We've been involved in supporting the Governor's Housing Task Force. The chair is serving on the Itasca Project's Housing Task Force. So there's a lot of ways that the council overall provides technical assistance and really has participated in expanding the affordable housing dialogue. So with our time together today, I hope we've gotten through understanding what is affordable housing, the council's role in housing policy, ranging from the housing policy plan all the way to technical assistance. And with that, I would be happy to take any additional questions that you have.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Starling? Councilmember Muse.
Do you have any information on workforce housing?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Muse, workforce housing is a term that is sometimes used as a way of thinking about affordable housing, specifically for people who are presumed to be in the workforce. So looking at more kind of the 50% of area median income, 60%, sometimes up to 80% of area median income. So as I said earlier on, we were talking about what is affordable housing. The term workforce housing has a range of meanings to people. But with the data that the council has, we can look at how much of housing is available at different income thresholds in the cities across the region.
Further questions? Councilmember Johnson, then Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to try to dig a little bit deeper in the studies or reports around the naturally occurring affordable housing in the region. And it's interesting because that's the place where I feel we have to be in preservation mode, because that's the biggest amount of affordable housing that we have. And yet, ironically, you'll see communities that are really pushing to expand new development type housing. So they'll be actually encouraging tearing down what might be affordable housing and then trying to build the bigger home with the more bedrooms and all that. And then at the very same time, you've got communities in the far-flung suburbs that have expensive land that are trying to do the affordable housing. So I've always been curious, not to be answered here tonight, but why instead of by city, even though I know it's parochial and they've got powers within their city, why we aren't looking more sub-regionally, because workers and jobs and schools and people are fluid between cities. So you'll have one community that's neighboring tearing down affordable housing. The next community is trying to build it in, cornfields that are going for $500,000 an acre. So I'm just leaving that there because this is one of my top priorities. I'm a big affordable housing advocate, but it is so difficult because it's such a big region and we're all doing things. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Thank you, and I won't ask you to respond to that, Ms. Starling. You're welcome. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf and Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You actually just totally teed one up for me, because I was going to point out that not all of the region does affordable housing in the same way. Dakota County does it on a county level rather than on a city by city level. So the county controls the tax credits, they control the housing vouchers and all of that sort of stuff, and all of the entire county gets taxed for affordable housing. So not just the cities, everybody gets taxed, and then the county puts it throughout where it's needed and intentionally does not concentrate it in any one community or any one neighborhood. So there are other ways that parts of the region are looking at. So it's important when we're doing this work not to just think how they do things in your backyard, because different parts of the region do their affordable housing in very different ways.
Thank you. Councilmember Lee.
I just wanted to thank Councilmember Johnson for her remarks, and I want to second that on the record because that was one of the major tenets of my platform when I applied to be a council member. And I understand that we have more carrots than sticks in this area, but I already have constituents emailing me about affordable housing and issues of housing insecurity. So this is a pickle that we really have to work hard on.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. I think one thing that would be helpful going forward is to, in the documents and in the presentation, when it talks about the role of the council, it'd be helpful to delineate that between the role of the council staff and the role of the council members and committee members. It'd be helpful to see what are we doing, what are our responsibilities. I mean, in reading the plan and looking, for example, under the guidance around equity, it's our responsibility to ensure that we're having compliance and conformance as it relates to the plans that before us. That's what I believe our responsibility is. So to be knowledgeable about those as council members, but I think it'll be helpful as we're continuing to learn and onboard that we're having explicit conversations about that and how that shows up and what does that look like. And I realize just, so that's just a point of information. I'd also like to know, and going forward, and maybe it's part of a broader conversation around our equity work in general, but what if we could get like a description of, or understanding or accounting of, what are we doing currently around the 30% AMI? Like, what number of units have been created? What's in the pipeline? What's been done? What's going to be done? And I know that Councilmember Musai's asked a lot about larger units, and that's so important for so many of our growing populations here in the metro region. So the same information about that would be really helpful to have too. So what does that look like? We're doing it, but what are we doing? Recognizing that I also believe, and I'm happy to be corrected in this, that we have a deficit of affordable housing in our region.
Extreme deficit.
Right.
Ms. Barajas, yeah.
Ask a follow-up for you. Councilmember Allison Gibbertson, when you ask what are we doing currently around 30%, are you asking what are we as the council doing, or we as the region, or both?
That would be great. A yes and.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Starling, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay, thank you. Further discussion? Councilmember Musai.
It will be interesting to know what toolbox we have in our toolbox in terms of carrots and sticks. Just we want to know what we have, how can we utilize that to address this issue. This is really very critical issue, and we need to be bold and courageous.
Thank you. Further discussion? Further discussion? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Starling, for that very comprehensive, and you covered a lot of territory here, so thank you. And any other business to come before this committee? Seeing none, we're adjourned.